Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring Aliens Among Us, Volume 2. I'm a Stranger Here Myself, by Mack Reynolds. What's he doing in there, by Fritz Leiber. If at First, by Venable. The Frogs of Mars, by Roger D. Aycock. The Fugitives, by Malcolm B. Morehart, Jr. I'm a Stranger Here Myself, by Mack Reynolds. Originally published in Amazing Stories, December 1960. Narrated by Trussel. The Place de France is the town's hub. It marks the end of the Boulevard Pasteur, the main drag of the westernized part of the city, and the beginning of Rue de la Liberté, which leads down to the Grand Socco and the Medina. In a 3-minute walk from the Place de France, you can go from an ultra-modern California-like resort to the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid. It's quite a town, Tangier. King-size sidewalk cafes occupy 3 of the strategic corners on the Place de France. The Café de Paris serves the best draft beer in town, gets all the better custom, and has 3 shoeshine boys attached to the establishment. You can sit on a sunny morning and read the Paris edition of the New York Herald Tribune while getting your shoes done up like mirrors for 30 Moroccan francs, which comes to about 5 cents at current exchange. You can sit there after the paper's read, sip your espresso, and watch the people go by. Tangier is possibly the most cosmopolitan city in the world. In native costume you'll see Berber and Rif, Arab and Blue Man, and occasionally a Senegalese from further south. In European dress you'll see Japs and Chinese, Hindus and Turks, Levantines and Filipinos, North Americans and South Americans, and, of course, even Europeans, from both sides of the curtain. In Tangier you'll find some of the world's poorest and some of the richest. The poorest will try to sell you anything from a shoeshine to their not very lily-white bodies, and the richest will avoid your eyes, afraid you might try to sell them something. In spite of recent changes, the town still has its unique qualities. As a result of them, the permanent population includes smugglers and black marketeers, fugitives from justice and international conmen, espionage and counter-espionage agents, homosexuals, nymphomaniacs, alcoholics, drug addicts, displaced persons, ex-royalty, and subversives of every flavour. Local law limits the activities of few of these. Like I said, it's quite a town. I looked up from my Herald Tribune and said, "Hello, Paul. Anything new cooking?" He sank into the chair opposite me and looked around for the waiter. The tables were all crowded, and since mine was a face he recognized, he assumed he was welcome to intrude. It was more or less standard procedure at the Café de Paris. It wasn't a place to go if you wanted to be alone. Paul said, "How are you, Rupert? Haven't seen you for donkey's years." The waiter came along, and Paul ordered a glass of beer. Paul was an easy-going, sallow-faced little man. I vaguely remembered somebody saying he was from Liverpool and in exports. "What's in the newspaper?" he said disinterestedly. "Pogo and Albert are going to fight a duel," I told him, "and Lil Abner is becoming a rock-and-roll singer." He grunted. "Oh," I said, "the intellectual type." I scanned the front page. The Ruskies have put up another manned satellite. "They have, eh? How big?" "Several times bigger than anything we Americans have." The beer came and looked good, so I ordered a glass too. Paul said, "Whatever happened to those poxy flying saucers?" What flying saucers? A French girl went by with a poodle so finely clipped as to look as though it had been shaven. The girl was in the latest from Paris, every paw in place. We both looked after her. You know, what everybody was seeing a few years ago. It's too bad one of these bloody manned satellites wasn't up then. Maybe they would have seen one. That's an idea, I said. We didn't say anything else for a while, and I began to wonder if I could go back to my paper without rubbing him the wrong way. I didn't know Paul very well, but, for that matter, it's comparatively seldom you ever get to know anybody very well in Tangier. Largely, cards are played close to the chest. My beer came, and a plate of tapas for us both. Tapas at the Café de Paris are apt to be potato salad, a few anchovies, olives, and possibly some cheese. Free lunch, they used to call it in the States. Just to say something, I said, "Where do you think they came from?" And when he looked blank, I added, "The flying saucers." He grinned. "From Mars or Venus, or someplace." I said. "Too bad none of them ever crashed, or landed on the Yale football field and said, 'Take me to your cheerleader,' or something." Paul yawned and said, "That was always a trouble with those crackpot blokes' explanations of them. If they were aliens from space, then why not show themselves?" I ate one of the potato chips. It had been cooked in rancid olive oil. I said, "Oh, there are various answers to that one. We could probably sit around here and think of 2 or 3 that made sense." Paul was mildly interested. "Like what?" "Well, hell, suppose, for instance, there's this big galactic league of civilized planets, but it's restricted, see? You're not eligible for membership until until you've developed spaceflight. Then you're invited into the club. Meanwhile, they send secret missions down from time to keep an eye on your progress." Paul grinned at me. "I see you read the same poxy stuff I do." A Moorish girl went by, dressed in a neatly tailored grey jalaba, European-style high-heeled shoes, and a pinkish silk veil so transparent that you could see she wore lipstick. Very provocative. Dark eyes can be over a veil. We both looked after her. I said, "Oh, here's another one. Suppose you have a very advanced civilization on, say, Mars." "Not Mars. No air, and too bloody dry to support life." "Don't interrupt, please," I said with mock severity. "This is a very old civilization, and as the planet began to lose its water and air, it withdrew underground, uses hydroponics and so forth, husbands its water and air. Isn't that what we'd do in a few million years, if Earth lost its water and air?" "I suppose so," he said. "Anyway, what about them?" "Well, they observe how man is going through a scientific boom, an industrial boom, a population boom, a boom, period. Any day now he's going to have practical spaceships. Meanwhile, he's also got the H-bomb, and the way he beats the drums on both sides of the curtain, he's not against using it, if he could get away with it." Paul said, "I got it. So they're scared and are keeping an eye on us. That's an old one. I've read that a dozen times, dished up different." I shifted my shoulders. "Well, it's one possibility." "I got a better one. How's this? There's this alien life form that's way ahead of us. Their civilization is so old that they don't have any records of when it began and how it was in the early days. They've gone beyond things like wars and depressions and revolutions, and greed for power, or any of these things giving us a bad time here on Earth. They're all like scholars, get it? And some of them are pretty jolly well taken by Earth, especially the way we are right now, with all the problems, get it? Things developing so fast we don't know where we're going or how we're going to get there." I finished my beer and clapped my hands for Mooley. "How do you mean, where we're going?" "Well, take half the countries in the world today. They're trying to industrialize, modernize, catch up with the advanced countries. Look at Egypt, and Israel, and India, and China, and Yugoslavia, and Brazil, and all the rest, trying to drag themselves up to the level of the advanced countries, and all using different methods of doing it. But look at the so-called advanced countries, up to their bottoms in problems, juvenile delinquents, climbing crime and suicide rates, the loony bins full of the balmy, unemployed, threat of war, spending all their money on armaments instead of things like schools, all the bloody mess of it. Why, a man from Mars would be fascinated like. Mooley came shuffling up in his babouche slippers, and we both ordered another schooner of beer. Paul said seriously, "You know, there's only one big snag in this sort of talk. I've sorted the whole thing out before, and you always come up against this brick wall. Where are they, these observers, or scholars, or spies, or whatever they are? Sooner or later we'd nab one of them. You know, Scotland Yard, or the FBI, or Russia's secret police, or the French Sûreté, or Interpol. This world is so deep in police, counter-espionage outfits, and security agents that an alien would slip up in time, no matter how much he'd been trained. Sooner or later, he'd slip up, and they'd nab him." I shook my head. "Not necessarily. The first time I ever considered this possibility, it seemed to me that such an alien would base himself in London or New York, somewhere where he could use the libraries for research, get the daily newspapers and the magazines, be right in the centre of things. But now, I don't think so. I think he'd be right here in Tangier." "Why Tangier?" "It's the one town in the world where anything goes. Nobody gives a damn about you or your affairs. For instance, I've known you a year or more now, and I haven't the slightest idea of how you make your living." "That's right," Paul admitted. "In this town, you seldom even ask a man where he's from. He can be British, a White Russian, a Basque, or a Sikh, and nobody could care less. Where are you from, Rupert?" "California," I told him. "No, you're not," he grinned. I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I felt your mind probe back a few minutes ago when I was talking about Scotland Yard or the FBI, possibly flushing an alien. Telepathy is a sense not trained by the humanoids. If they had it, your job, and mine, would be considerably more difficult. Let's face it, in spite of these human bodies we're disguised in, neither of us is humanoid. Where are you really from, Rupert?" "Aldebaran," I said. "How about you?" "Deneb," he told me, shaking. We had a laugh and ordered another beer. "What are you doing here on Earth?" I asked him. "Researching for one of our meat trusts. We're protein eaters. Humanoid flesh is considered quite a delicacy. How about you?" "Scouting the place for thrill tourists. My job is to go around to these backward cultures and help stir up intertribal or international conflicts, all according to how advanced they are. Then our tourists come in, well shielded of course, and get their kicks watching it." Paul frowned. "That sort of practice could spoil an awful lot of good meat."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
What's He Doing in There? By Fritz Leiber. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, December 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The professor was congratulating Earth's first visitor from another planet on his wisdom in getting in touch with a cultural anthropologist before contacting any other scientists or governments, God forbid, and in learning English from radio and TV before landing from his orbit-parked rocket, when the Martian stood up and said hesitantly, "Excuse me, please, but where is it?" That baffled the professor, and the Martian seemed to grow anxious. At least his long mouth curved upward, and he had earlier explained that it curling downward was his smile. And he repeated, "Please, where is it?"
He was surprisingly humanoid in most respects, but his complexion was textured so like the rich dark armchair he'd just been occupying that the professor's pinstriped grey suit, which he had eagerly consented to wear, seemed an arbitrary interruption between him and the chair, a sort of Mother Hubbard dress on a phantom conjured from its leather. The professor's wife, always a perceptive hostess, came to her husband's rescue by saying with equal rapidity, "Top of the stairs, end of the hall, last door." The Martian's mouth curled happily downward, and he said, "Thank you very much," and was off. Comprehension burst on the professor. He caught up with his guest at the foot of the stairs. "Here, I'll show you the way," he said. "No, I can find it myself, thank you," the Martian assured him. Something rather final in the Martian's tone made the professor desist, and after watching his visitor sway up the stairs with an almost hypnotic, softly jogging movement, he rejoined his wife in the study, saying wonderingly, "Who'd have thought it, by George? Function taboos as strict as our own." "I'm glad some of your professional visitors maintain 'em," his wife said darkly. "But this one's from Mars, darling, and to find out he's, well, similar in an aspect of his life is as thrilling as a discovery that water is burnt hydrogen. When I think of the day not far distant when I'll put his entries in the cross-cultural index—" He was still rhapsodizing when the professor's little son raced in. "Pop, the Martian's gone to the bathroom." "Hush, dear, manners." "Now it's perfectly natural, darling, that the boys should notice and be excited. Yes, son, the Martian's not so very different from us." "Oh, certainly," the professor's wife said with a trace of bitterness. "I don't imagine his turquoise complexion will cause any comment at all when you bring him to a faculty reception. They'll just figure he's had a hard night, and that he's got that baby elephant nose sniffing around for assistant professorships. Really, darling, he probably thinks of our noses as disagreeably amputated and paralyzed." "Well, anyway, Pop, he's in the bathroom. I followed him when he squiggled upstairs." "Now, son, you shouldn't have done that. He's on a strange planet, and it might make him nervous if he thought he was being spied on. We must show him every courtesy. By George, I can't wait to discuss these things with Ackley Ramsbottom. When I think of how much more this encounter has to give the anthropologist than even the physicist or astronomer." He was still going strong on his second rhapsody when he was interrupted by another high-speed entrance. It was the professor's coltish daughter. "Mum, Pop, the Martians." "Hush, dear, we know." The professor's coltish daughter regained her adolescent poise, which was considerable. "Well, he's still in there," she said. "I just tried the door and it was locked." "I'm glad it was," the professor said, while his wife added, "Yes, you can't be sure what—" and caught herself. "Really, dear, that was very bad manners." "I thought he'd come downstairs long ago," her daughter explained. "He's been in there an awfully long time. It must have been a half an hour ago that I saw him gyre and gimble upstairs in that real gone way he has, with Nosy here following him." The professor's coltish daughter was currently soaking up both Jive and Alice. When the professor checked his wristwatch, his expression grew troubled. By George, he is taking his time. Though, of course, we don't know how much time Martians— I wonder. "I listened for a while, Pop," his son volunteered. "He was running the water a lot." "Running the water, eh? We know Mars is a water-starved planet. I suppose that in the presence of unlimited water he might be seized by a kind of madness, but he seemed so well adjusted." Then his wife spoke, voicing all their thoughts. Her outlook on life gave her a naturally sepulchral voice. "What's he doing in there?" 20 minutes, and at least as many fantastic suggestions later, the professor glanced again at his watch and nerved himself for action. Motioning his family aside, he mounted the stairs and tiptoed down the hall. He paused only once to shake his head and mutter under his breath, "By George, I wish I had Fenchurch or von Gottschalk here. They're a shade better than I am on intercultural contracts, especially taboo breakings and affronts." His family followed him at a short distance. The professor stopped in front of the bathroom door. Everything was quiet as death. He listened for a minute and then rapped measuredly, steadying his hand by clutching its wrist with the other. There was a faint splashing, but no other sound. Another minute passed. The professor rapped again. Now there was no response at all. He very gingerly tried the knob. The door was still locked. When they had retreated to the stairs, it was the professor's wife who once more voiced their thoughts. This time her voice carried overtones of supernatural horror. "What's he doing in there?" "He may be dead or dying," the professor's coltish daughter suggested briskly. "Maybe we ought to call the fire department, like they did for old Mrs. Frisbee." The professor winced. "I'm afraid you haven't visualized the complications, dear," he said gently. "No one but ourselves knows that the Martian is on Earth, or has even the slightest inkling that interplanetary travel has been achieved. Whatever we do, it will have to be on our own. But to break in on a creature engaged in, well, we don't know what primal private activity, is against all anthropological practice. Still—" "Dying's a primal activity," his daughter said crisply. "So's ritual bathing before mass murder," his wife added. "Please. Still, as I was about to say, we do have the moral duty to succor him, if, as you all too reasonably suggest, he has been incapacitated by a germ or virus, or, more likely, by some simple environmental factor such as Earth's greater gravity." "Tell you what, Pop, I can look in the bathroom window and see what he's doing. All I have to do is crawl out my bedroom window and along the gutter a little ways. It's safe as houses." The professor's question, beginning with, "Son, how do you know?" died unuttered, and he refused to notice the words his daughter was voicing silently at her brother. He glanced at his wife's sardonically composed face, thought once more of the fire department, and of other and larger and even more jealous, or would it be skeptical, government agencies, and clutched at the straw offered him. 10 minutes later, he was quite unnecessarily assisting his son back through the bedroom window. "Gee, Pop, I couldn't see a sign of him. That's why it took so long. Hey, Pop, don't look so scared. He's in there, sure enough. It's just that the bathtub's under the window and you have to get real close up to see into it." "The Martian's taking a bath?" "Yep. Got it full up and just the end of his little old schnozzle sticking out. Your suit, Pop, was hanging on the door." The one word the professor's wife spoke was like a death knell. "Drowned!" "No, Ma, I don't think so. His schnozzle was opening and closing regular-like." "Maybe he's a shape-changer," the professor's coltish daughter said in a burst of evil fantasy. "Maybe he softens in water and thins out after a while until he's like an eel, and then he'll go exploring through the sewer pipes. Wouldn't it be funny if he went under the street and knocked on the stopper from underneath and crawled into the bathtub with President Rexford, or Mrs. President Rexford, or maybe right into the middle of one of Janie Rexford's Oh, I'm So Sexy bubble baths?" "Please." The professor put his hand to his eyebrows and kept it there, cuddling the elbow in his other hand. "Well, have you thought of something?" the professor's wife asked him after a bit. "What are you going to do?" The professor dropped his hand and blinked his eyes hard and took a deep breath. "Telegraph Fenchurch and Ackley Ramsbottom, and then break in," he said in a resigned voice, into which, nevertheless, a note of hope seemed also to have come. "First, however, I'm going to wait until morning." And he sat down cross-legged in the hall a few yards from the bathroom door and folded his arms. So the long vigil commenced. The professor's family shared it, and he offered no objection. Other and sterner men, he told himself, might claim to be able successfully to order their children to go to bed when there was a Martian locked in the bathroom, but he would like to see them faced with the situation. Finally dawn began to seep from the bedrooms. When the bulb in the hall had grown quite dim, the professor unfolded his arms. Just then there was a loud splashing in the bathroom. The professor's family looked toward the door. The splashing stopped, and they heard the Martian moving around. Then the door opened, and the Martian appeared in the professor's grey pinstripe suit. His mouth curled sharply downward in a broad alien smile as he saw the professor. "Good morning," the Martian said happily. "I have never slept better in my life, even in my own little wet bed back on Mars." He looked around more closely, and his mouth straightened. "But where did you all sleep?" he asked. "Don't tell me you stayed dry all night. You didn't give up your only bed to me." His mouth curled upward in misery. "Oh dear," he said, "I'm afraid I've made a mistake somehow, yet I don't understand how. Before I studied you, I didn't know what your sleeping habits would be, but that question was answered for me. In fact, it looked so reassuringly homelike when I saw those brief TV scenes of your females ready for sleep in their little tubs. Of course, on Mars, only the fortunate can always be sure of sleeping wet, but here, with your abundance of water, I thought there would be wet beds for all." He paused. "It's true I had some doubts last night, wondering if I'd used the right words and all, but then when you rapped good night to me, I splashed the sentiment back at you and went to sleep in a wink. But I'm afraid that somewhere I've blundered and—" No, dear chap," the professor managed to say. He had been waving his hand in a gentle circle for some time in token that he wanted to interrupt. "Everything's quite all right. It's true we stayed up all night, but please consider that as a watch, an honor guard, by George, which we kept to indicate our esteem."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. If at First, by Bill Venable, originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, Winter 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Mr. 3 took the small grey box from his pocket. Smiling, he handed it to Mr. 7. "Wait!" exclaimed Shalimar Smith. "Sorry," said Mr. 7, pressing the red button on the right-hand side of the box. Shalimar Smith disappeared from the room. "An excellent plan indeed," commented Mr. 1. Mrs. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 nodded agreement and muttered among themselves. "And now," pursued Mr. 7, "stage 2. He pressed the green button on the left-hand side of the grey box. The Misters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 also disappeared from the room. Shalimar Smith's living room stood empty. Immediately after Mr. 7 had pressed the red button on the right-hand side of the grey box, Shalimar Smith found himself sitting comfortably in a reclining seat on a fast-moving train. After contemplating the sudden transition and making himself thoroughly dizzy, he turned in some alarm to considering where he was going. He peered out the window, trying to make something from the mixture of blackness and lights spinning by, overlaid by stationary reflections from inside the car. "Your ticket, sir," said the conductor for the second time. Oh!" Shalimar looked up, felt in the breast pocket of his coat for a ticket that was not there. "Here it—" He pulled the pocket inside out. "Isn't," he finished lamely. "That's nice," said the conductor sarcastically. Shalimar groaned and dug into his other pockets, distributing the contents over the seat. Finally he gave a cry of jubilation, pulled his hand from his inside coat pocket, and handed the conductor a small square of cardboard. The conductor punched 3 heart-shaped holes through Shalimar's name, and handed him back his driver's license. Shalimar gazed at it stupidly. "I must have lost it," he ventured. The thoroughly enraged official grabbed Shalimar by the scruff of his coat in an undignified way, pulling the emergency cord with his other hand. He shoved the unfortunate man down the aisle of the car as the train slowed to a halt. "Stop!" shouted Shalimar. "Why?" grunted the conductor savagely, shoving him out of the door as the speed of the train diminished. Shalimar landed on his hands and knees, rolled for several yards, and skidded to a halt on his stomach. He sat up and watched in exasperation as the train gathered speed and roared away into the darkness. Finally he stood up, rubbing his head with one hand and feeling of his skinned knee with the other, and took stock of his surroundings. A moon in quarter phase illuminated dimly the gleaming lines of the railroad tracks, showed a tree in silhouette on a hill not far away. Clouds scudded across the sky. Shalimar endeavored to ascertain where he was, gave up, and headed toward the hill and the silhouetted tree. In the far distance the whistle of a train wailed mournfully. From the top of the hill, Shalimar looked over a country of rolling plains and grain fields. A single light shone yellow about a half-mile off, probably a farmhouse. Shalimar headed off toward the light, mentally cursing the monotonous chirping clamour of crickets and other nocturnal insects. He was trying to remember something of vital importance, something that he had to remember before it was too late. The memory hung there, just below the surface of conscious thought, defying him, taunting him. Eventually the lighted window showed clearly through a nearby grove of trees, and the outlines of a small farmhouse stood out against the dim sky. He walked up the gravel path and knocked on the door. Steps sounded inside, and the door opened, a crack of light shining out onto the ground. A face peered at him, withdrew, and the door opened wide. A figure stood silhouetted against the light. "Come in," said Mr. Seven. "Oh no!" Shalimar turned and started to run off. Mr. Seven grasped him firmly by the coat collar and dragged him back into the house. "Let me go," gurgled Shalimar, gagging as his shirt collar pressed tightly against his throat. "Not until," Mr. Seven began, his face suddenly brightening. Footsteps scraped up the gravel path, and Misters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 strode into the room. Mr. 3 expeditiously took the small grey box from his pocket and handed it to Mr. 7. "Nowhere around here," he said briskly. "Probably off another psychological sidetrack." Mr. 7's hand released Shalimar's coat collar and poised over the red button on the right-hand side of the box. "Wait!" cried Shalimar. Mr. 7 depressed the button. Shalimar Smith disappeared from the room. Mr. 7 then pressed the green button on the left-hand side of the box. The Misters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 vanished in like manner. The silent emptiness of the room was broken only by the sound of the bound and gagged farmer grunting from inside a handy closet. Shalimar Smith abruptly felt himself falling. He had just realized that fact, and something cold, hard, and wet slapped against his face and engulfed him, and he submerged gaspingly in the water. He came up, choking and treading water, and took his bearings. He had just done a perfect jackknife from the high board of the public swimming pool in Stockton, Ohio. A quarter moon glinted faintly off the surface of the water. He was aware of the fact that he was still fully dressed, and that his clothes were soaking up water at an alarming rate, bearing him down. He swam clumsily over to the edge of the pool and climbed out. Then he sat down on the edge and began contemplating this new facet of the whole fantastic experience. He knew the pool well enough, had swum in it many times when he had lived in this small town in Ohio, before getting married and going to New York. The question of how he had gotten here bothered him not so much as why he had. Something was trying to come to the surface of his mind again, the same urgent something which had bothered him after he had been thrown off the train. He grasped at the memory, cursing at it eluded him deftly time and again. When footsteps sounded on the concrete walk leading to the pool, he looked up. It was a night watchman. The man was swinging a flashlight at his side, throwing the beam around him as he walked. Probably he had heard the splash and was coming to investigate. Shalimar sighed and stood up. The flashlight beam swung toward him, illuminating him embarrassingly and causing him to blink at the spot of white light before him. A suspicious voice asked, "What you doing here at this time of night? Pool's closed." "Yes, I know," Shalimar thought hard. I was walking in my sleep and fell into the pool." "With all your clothes on?" The beam of light lowered and Shalimar could see again. The watchman stood outlined against the darker trees, his face a blurred shadow. "Yes, I fell asleep in my chair as I was reading the paper." "Heh, at 1 o'clock in the morning. Where you live?" Shalimar hadn't known it was so late. He racked his brains. "Just over the hill on Walnut Street." The watchman stepped up and looked him over in the light of the flash. Don't know you. Must be new in town. You the one who bought the old Schultz place?" "Why, yeah." "Heh, thought that was a woman. Well, I guess it's okay. Better watch where you wander off to at night, though." "Yeah." Shalimar breathed a sigh of relief and began to walk off. "Good night." "Better take one of them antihistamines when you get home. Sound like you're coming down with a cold. Good night." The watchman strolled back toward his shack. Shalimar gulped. Close. He began trying to remember again. "Hey," yelled the watchman suddenly. "Just thought of something. How'd you get into the pool? I'd have seen you if you come in the gate, and the other 3 sides is walled off." Shalimar had hoped the watchman wouldn't think of that. He began to run down the driveway. "Wait up!" cried the watchman. "Stop, or I'll shoot!" Shalimar ran. 3 shots buzzed by him. Then it was safely around the corner and away. He ducked down a tree-lined street, ran around the corner house and off across the backyard. Behind him, he heard the man run on down the main street, yelling. This was bad. The old fool would wake up the authorities, if not the whole town. Why did that damned button transport him into such messes? He ducked down an alley and into a small tool shed which he noticed at the end of it. What to do next? He stood in the shed, panting. As he backed up to the far wall, something brushed his face. A light cord. He pulled on it. The shed exploded into light. Mr. Seven stood leaning against the far side of the shed, arms folded across chest. "Failed again," he remarked philosophically. Shalimar leaped back with a cry. The Misters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, standing along the farther wall, murmured among themselves in interested tones. "He has too many memory sidetracks," remarked Mr. 3, handing Mr. 7 the small grey box. "It certainly wasn't here. Nothing to do but try again." Mr. 7's finger hovered over the red button on the box's right-hand side. Shalimar braced himself. Mr. 7 shoved violently down on the button. Shalimar behaved in the expected fashion. He vanished. Mr. 7 then pressed the green button on the left side. He and his colleagues followed after Shalimar. Immediately after Mr. 7 pressed the aforementioned red button, Shalimar Smith felt a violent pain on the top of his head, followed shortly by another. He deduced that somebody was beating him over the head with something. "Peeping Tom!" shrieked the outraged woman. "Help, police!" She poised the vase for another blow. Shalimar winced as it descended and took stock of where he was. He found that he was hanging by his fingertips from a ledge about 5 stories up on an apartment building in what must be a rather large city. It was, in fact, a window ledge, and immediately above him, leaning from the window, was a woman in a rather flimsy negligee, screaming and wielding a spiked heel on top of his defenceless cranium. He groaned as the heel descended for the 5th time on his skull. Then the shoe slipped from her grasp and fell to the street below. He remembered vaguely that he had once lived in an apartment like the one to whose window ledge he clung, probably even the same apartment, and that he had been accustomed to wash the windows from the outside. That explained his position. Now the shoe had been replaced by another makeshift weapon. A goldfish bowl came down upon him, showering him with fish, water, and splinters of glass. Below, a cruising precinct police car had stopped, and several men sporting the blue uniform of the law were looking up. "Come down from there," demanded a wrathful voice from below. "How?" gasped Shalimar weakly. "Come down, I say," shouted the voice. Several people in adjoining apartments were looking out their respective windows at the scene and thoroughly enjoying his discomfiture. Shalimar cursed them and edged his way along the ledge until he felt another one under his feet. He came to a standing position on the lower one, hugging the wall of the building. The lady in the negligee poised a vase of flowers preparatory for heaving at him. "Hell!" groaned Shalimar, ducking as the vase shattered against the wall above his head. He edged his way around the corner of the building where the lady could no longer see him and slipped into an open window. A man lay sleeping in the apartment he had just entered. Praying that the man was a heavy sleeper, Shalimar tiptoed through the apartment and out into the hall. By now, he imagined the place was a bedlam. The elevator was coming up, loaded with police no doubt, and footsteps were ascending the stairs. Shalimar spotted a weathered door and ducked through it. He emerged on the roof. Looking over the edge, he was immediately spotted from below. Cries of, "There he is, and on the roof!" floated to his horrified ears. He ran across the roof and jumped to an adjoining one. He zigzagged across it, keeping well away from the edges, and reached yet another adjoining roof. There he popped into a small utility shed. Stairs led down, and Shalimar followed them, not bothering to worry where they went. He raced down 6 flights and emerged in the basement. Dark, too dark to see anything, but there was no mistaking that voice. "Wrong again," said Mr. Seven cheerfully. Shalimar couldn't see, but he knew that Mr. Seven was pressing the small red button. There was not enough light for anybody to see that Shalimar had once more vanished. Apparently, nothing had happened. Shalimar waited expectantly. The darkness was as blank as ever. Shalimar looked about him, felt the air about him. Nothing. He took several steps forward. Bam! Shalimar fell back. No mistaking that rough surface. He had just bumped into a tree. Cautiously he approached it again, feeling in front of him with his hands. Presently he encountered the rough bark. He could put his arms around the tree. He felt upward and got a surprise. It was broken off at the top, rather burnt or charred off. Why? His memory went to work again. He was getting closer now, much closer. Something was coming to the surface of his conscious mind, something that he had had to remember, something. He noticed then that it was lighter. A wind was blowing, the sky showed palely overhead. Clouds were obscuring the stars and moon. Vague outlines of other blasted trees showed against the dull sky. The ground wasn't the way ground should be, glassy, hard. He knew this place, but where? When? Then he saw it, the tall thing, cylindrical and with a pointed nose shoved at the sky. He began to remember, though it came slowly. He thought, the tall thing, with a tapered nose silhouetted against the sky, was home. "I presume you have by now broken away from the limitations of your disintegrating Earth personality," said a familiar voice. Mr. Seven, and he knew Mr. Seven. "When we arrived almost 20 years ago in the role of a galactic study group assigned to determine whether the planet Earth was yet fit for full galactic citizenship, said Mr. Seven slowly. "We found it necessary to assume the roles, separately, of representative beings of Earth in order to obtain what information we required about arousing suspicion. To do this was necessary, though standard psychological procedure, to isolate the larger portion of our complete galactic personalities and to leave only a small pseudo-personality, completely equipped with Earth memories, under which guide we might proceed with our studies. In order to assure complete control of the Earth personality, it was of course necessary to isolate the galactic one completely, and further to remove all knowledge of its existence until such a predetermined time as we would be finished with our work and ready to return home." Mr. Seven droned on. Shalimar nodded, and remembered. "Our study of Earth now being finished, we shall return to our headquarters. We could not return, however, until we located the ship in which we had come, and you were the key to that." Shalimar remembered now. He was... "You gave us a rather hard time," continued Mr. Seven. "Because my personality was the most psychologically malleable," Shalimar said slowly. "I was chosen to hide the ship where it would be safe until we required it. The 7 of you teleported to the Earth's surface and waited while I hid the ship. We did not know its location. Then I alone knew where the ship was, and because I was the most malleable, my Earth personality was the most foolproof. Therefore, it was extremely unlikely that in any moments of duress or psychological strain I would babble the location of the ship, which it was imperative to guard." "But," said Mr. Seven, "your Earth personality was too well integrated. The location of the ship was locked somewhere in your subconscious and wouldn't come out. The only thing we could do was teleport you to various places in your memory, stimulating your galactic personality each time, and hope that eventually you would lead us to the ship." "Which," said Shalimar, "I did." "Which you did," agreed Mr. Seven. "Are we ready, then, to take off, Captain?" "We are ready, Lieutenant," said Shalimar Smith, otherwise Mr. Zero. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Frogs of Mars by Roger D. Aycock, writing as Roger D. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, April 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. There was nothing special about the little man who came into Larry's place, unless it might have been his air of vague familiarity and the mixed expression on his face. He looked disgusted and defensive, and at the same time a little resentful, with a dash of something else thrown in which none of us recognized until later. I'd have mistaken him for another reporter from the Advertiser across the street if the 5 newsmen already at the bar hadn't given each other a blank look that meant only one thing: none of them knew him. Neither did Larry, who was trying to bring in the first broadcast from Mars on the television set bracketed on the wall over his whiskey stock, and who wasn't pleased at having his little after-hours party crashed. "The bar's closed," Larry said. His tone didn't invite argument. "City ordinance. No customers after 1 a.m. The little man looked at the clock, which said 3:15, and then at the front windows, which were shuttered tight. Then he looked at the 6 of us sitting at the bar with our drinks. "I'll have bourbon and water," he said. He sat down at the end of the bar on the stool next to mine and looked at his reflection in the mirror without approval. Larry got the look that bartenders get with troublesome customers. "The bar's closed," he said again. "It's a city." "Water on the side," the little man said. "Don't mix it." Abe Marker, who does sports for the Advertiser, got up and checked the front door lock. The thumb catch hadn't been thrown, so Abe put it on and came back to the bar. "Nobody else will wander in," he said. "Make with the TV, Larry. You're holding up the show." Larry looked stubborn.
"It's after 1 a.m., he said, "and that door was supposed to be locked. There's a city ordinance." "You're breaking it already," the little man said, looking at us. He didn't seem angry, just weary and disgusted. "Not that I give a damn. All I want is a bourbon and water." "Better give it to him, Larry," Willard Saxton said from down the bar. Willard is the Advertiser's science editor and is an authority on the planets, especially Mars. "He'll probably turn you in if you throw him out." Larry muttered and looked mulish, but he rang up the little man's money and gave him a bourbon and water. The little guy drank it and looked at himself in the bar mirror with an expression that was just short of being a sneer. Larry grunted and went back to fiddling with the television set. Abe Marker came over and sat down on the stool to my left. "They're doing this all over town tonight," he said, explaining to the little man across me. "The bars have to observe curfew as usual, but most of them are letting a few regular customers stay late to see the Mars cast. Everybody is anxious to know what Colonel Sanderson and his crew found up there, so—" "They're going to be disappointed," the little man said. He sounded sour, but positive. "Mars ain't what people think it is, not by a hell of a sight. It stinks." We all looked up at that, and somebody snickered. "Have you been to Mars, sir?" The little man didn't seem to mind when we laughed. "Maybe," he said, and shoved his shot glass forward. "Another bourbon, bartender." The station announcer came on screen then, and told us what we already knew, that contact with Colonel Sanderson's party was delayed because of transmission difficulties. The Sanderson expedition would leave Mars for Earth in 2 more days, when the current opposition was completed. But in the meantime, the program sponsors appreciated the interest shown by their public, and would relay the broadcast to us as soon as contact was established. A film cartoon featuring a lizard named Freddy came on next, and Larry turned down the sound so he could hear orders for refills. The little man drank his bourbon and water, and sneered at his reflection in the mirror. None of us paid him any further attention, but talk started up again along the bar. Somebody at the other end asked how long it took a television signal to travel across all that space, and choked on his drink when Willard Saxton told him. "My God," he said when he stopped coughing. "You mean Mars is so far away it takes 3 minutes just to see it?" All of us laughed at that, but Larry and the little man at the end of the bar. "What I'm wondering," somebody else said, "is how the Colonel and his boys feel after breathing nothing but canned air for a year." "Maybe the air up there is better than us scientists think," Abe Marker said. He winked at us and looked at the little man on my right. "How about it, friend? Is the air good on Mars?" "Breathable, but not good," the little guy said. "It smells like dead fish." Silence fell along the bar while we waited for a straight man to raise his head. Willard Saxton took the bait. "And why would it smell so, may I ask?" "Because Mars is lousy with fish," the little man said, "and because when fish die, they stink." Larry did a brisk business for a few minutes while we sized the little guy up again. He definitely wasn't drunk, but the task of deciding whether he was being deadpan comic or just nasty was the sort of challenge that called for thought. "But you'd need extensive oceans to support so many fish," Willard Saxton argued, still taking it seriously. "And if Mars has oceans, we'd have seen them long ago. They reflect light." "Mars is too level for oceans," the little man said. "The water spreads out thin to make one big marsh, and you can't see it because the weeds that grow up from the bottom camouflage it." Somebody down the bar said, "This gets curiouser and curiouser," and everybody laughed again, but Willard and Larry and the little comic. Somebody else asked if he was a professional and what show was he on, but he didn't answer. He just pushed his shot glass forward instead. "Another bourbon," he said. The announcer came on screen again when the lizard cartoon went off, and said that the Mars party's signal was beginning to come through, and that as soon as it cleared up they would put it on the cable. Then he told us about a new kind of pretzel prepared with a special salt guaranteed not to give us hardening of the arteries, and after that we had another film cartoon. This one was about 2 crows at a circus, but nobody could follow it because Larry turned down the sound again. Between his 3rd and 4th stingers, Willard Saxton, who had a reputation to uphold, being science editor of the Advertiser, had made up his mind by now to put the little man in his place. It burned him brown to see his character drinking bourbon and sneering at himself in the mirror and not caring a damn what we thought, and it put Willard under a sort of obligation to show him up. "Reliable tests have conclusively proved," Willard said, "that the atmosphere of Mars contains only minute traces of water vapor, and that its oxygen content is less than 1/100th the density necessary to sustain human life. Spectroanalysis findings." "A spectroanalysis of Earth from Mars," the little man said, "shows nothing beyond our heaviside layer, and proves that we can't live there because nothing can breathe pure ozone." He finishes his bourbon and made up chains of wet ring on the bar top with his glass. The mixed look on his face was so strong that for a moment I almost thought of the name for it. Willard stalled for time by ordering another stinger, a double this time, and Abe Marker took over. "How about those pictures of Martian dust storms the boys at Palomar make?" Abe asked. "You can't have dust storms on a marshy planet, can you?" "Those aren't dust storms," the little man said. "They're clouds of gnats." "Gnats?" we all said at once, and somebody down the bar, quicker-witted than the rest of us, added, "Gnats to you, Charlie." "A fact," the little man said, but not as if he cared. "They travel in swarms thousands of miles wide, and they bite like hell." We sat and watched the 2 voiceless crows flap through the television cartoon for a while. Nobody spoke until the film was over and the screen went blank, when the little man caught Larry's eye and held up one finger. "Bourbon," he said. We heard a confused muttering of voices in the background and waited expectantly for Colonel Sanderson to speak to us from Mars, but apparently the network people were still having trouble with their transmission beam. The screen stayed blank. "You left out the interesting part, Charlie," somebody called from down the bar. "The Martian natives, what about them?" "There aren't any, as you'd know them," the little man said. He seemed to grow thoughtful for a moment. "But they are intelligent. They do things you couldn't do." "Such as what?" somebody asked. The little man shrugged. "Teleport. They're good at it, too." Saxton let out a laugh. "That would make them more intelligent than us," he said. "What do these Martians look like?" The little man screwed up his face distastefully. "Frogs." The reporter who had asked about natives got choked on his drink and had to be pounded on the back. On my left, Abe Marker leaned against the bar to look past me at the little guy. "Frogs we got now," he said admiringly. "By the billions?" "There are more frogs on Mars," the little man said, "than there are gnats and fish together, and they never stop croaking. You'd have to hear it to believe it." The television screen lit up suddenly, chopping off conversation, and we were watching the first Marscast in history. Colonel Sanderson himself was talking. He looked the way Stanley must have looked when he found Livingston, gaunt and bearded and jumpy, and his crew, lined up behind him before the ship's pickup camera, were in no better shape. The lot of them stared hungrily out at us as if they had just found a peephole into heaven and couldn't wait to see if there was a gate farther along the fence. "Established conceptions of Martian aerography are completely erroneous," the colonel was saying. "There are no drifting deserts of sand or howling typhoons of ferrous dust. We can show you actual conditions better by camera, I think, than they can be detailed in words." The view jumped to another camera aimed from an outside port, and we saw Mars. Colonel Sanderson's voice kept up a running commentary behind the scene, but we only half heard him. The ship rested in about 2 feet of water. Around it, the whole world curved up to the horizon in a shallow concave sweep, like the inside of a great rusty bowl, lined with knee-high reeds that grew as far as the eye could see out of a knee-deep marsh. A fist-sized sun hung low in the sky, its glare dulled to a muddy crimson by a shimmering cloud of gnats that whirled and danced to infinity. There was a sort of vast, featureless roaring in the background that sounded like Niagara at 200 yards, not deafening, but loud enough to force Colonel Sanderson to raise his voice. "The frog noise is worst," he was saying. "It drives us to the point of insanity at times. One member of our party has succumbed to it already, a machinist named Wilkins who disappeared 2 weeks ago. Apparently the poor fellow drowned himself in the marsh, since no trace of him has been found since." That was when I realized why the little man on the stool beside me looked so familiar, because I'd seen his pictures in the papers, along with the rest of Sanderson's crew, 1,000 times during the past year. The mixed expression on his face made sense now too. He wasn't only disgusted and defensive, he was guilty. "So that's how you knew what it was like," I said. "You couldn't stick it out with the others, so you jumped ship. You deserted." He gave me a hangdog look. "It's not deserting unless the country is at war," he said. "It's just going over the hill. AWOL." The television roar got louder, and when I looked up at the ship's cameraman was doing a close-up for our benefit. He panned the shot downward until we seemed to be standing 10 feet above the marsh, and at that distance I could see plainly what it was that caused the uproar. The water between the reddish-brown reeds was thick with huge frogs, all blinking and croaking like mad. I remember thinking then that you couldn't really blame a man for jumping ship in a hole like that. It was bad enough to be stuck 30-odd million miles from home, so far that light itself needed 3 minutes to— "Hey, wait up," I said to the little guy who was sneering at himself in the mirror again. "If you went AWOL up there, then how the hell did you get back here?" I didn't find out. The guy was gone. He had been standing there so close I could have touched him, but now he was gone. I looked around quick. Nobody else seemed to have noticed. All eyes were on the TV screen. Then I saw it. On the floor. 2 wet marks right where the guy should have been. Where he was. 2 wet marks that had a funny shape to them, web-like. I felt my throat tighten at the thought. I shook my head. What was going through it was fantastic, impossible, and downright lunacy. There was an intelligent life form on Mars. Beings that looked like frogs and could teleport. Could they also mimic human shape temporarily? Especially if they got hold of one for a model. Say a missing crewman. "Hey, where are you going? Don't you want to see the Mars cast?" I was walking to the door. I looked back at the barkeep. "I've seen enough, Larry. I got things to do." He shrugged. "Yeah, what?" "Like hunting frogs," I told him as I shoved the door open. "I got a hunch we'll be doing a lot of that before very long." The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Fugitives by Malcolm B. Morehart, Jr. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, September 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Jeff Engel studied the feverish crowd hurrying through the subway turnstiles. As he checked each passing face against a card index mind, he smiled to himself. Even when off duty, the habit persisted. There was always the chance he'd spot a face that would fit, one that would close another active file in Missing Persons Bureau. A mousy little guy slipped through the turnstile and bumped into a fat woman shopper. Engel glanced at the thin, apologetic face, and then at a briefcase bearing the faded initials CG. As a train rumbled in and the noise of the commuters rose, something glinted at Engels's feet.
He bent down, curious. It was a cheap fountain pen, inscribed with the same initials. He caught a glimpse of the stranger on the crowded subway stairs. "Wait a minute, mister," he yelled. When C.G. didn't turn, Engel hesitated, then pounded up the stairs into dazzling sunlight. He squinted around at people, and then over low bushes into the city park where he saw the little fellow walking briskly. Annoyed, Engel trotted down a shady walk, then down a quiet lane, and finally reached out to tap his shoulder. C.G. vanished in thin air. Engel slid to a halt and rubbed his eyes. Fearfully he explored this queer illusion, his hands pawing nothingness. There was a roar like 1,000 subway trains, and something invisible and powerful hurled him sprawling. He lay stunned as the noise died away, and then sat up to nurse a bruised head. Someone grabbed his arms, jerked him rudely to his feet, and spun him around. A tall, gangling cop glared down at him. "You been drinking?" What?" Engel stammered. Confused, he looked more closely at this man who wore a grey metallic uniform, a glittering badge, and an oddly shaped holster. "I wasn't drinking. Something pushed me." The cop smirked as he picked up the fountain pen and dusted it off with his gloves. "This yours?" he asked. "Yes, why, no," Engel sputtered. "It belongs to a guy I was chasing." The cop's thick eyebrows lifted. "He lost it, and I was trying to return it," Engel explained. "But he disappeared right in front of me." "Well, that's a new one," the cop said with a cynical smile. He seized Engel's arm and dragged him down the walk. "I'm running you in as a drunk and robbery suspect, bud." "But I didn't do anything," protested Engel. The cop scowled. "We'll see. If you're innocent, you'll get out of CD in a few minutes." "CD?" Engel echoed. "CD? CG? CD?" The initials hopped wildly about in his mind. At a soft whistling sound, he glanced up above a high hedge, and his eyes widened. Gleaming white towers rose up to fade into misty blue, and around them silently darted silvery bubbles. Faintly traced with jointed concentric lines, the skies seemed to curve over him like a lofty and enormous spider web. As he was pulled across a wide street, tall, hollow-cheeked people stopped to stare at him, and he stared back in wonder. "Who are they?" Engel faltered. The cop said nothing, and led him through the low entrance of a tower. As they went down a glowing hall, Engel touched the back of his still aching head. Was this fall in the park causing these hallucinations? Possibly. But before the fall, hadn't some mysterious, unseen force thrown him into this crazy world? Then he had to find it again, and somehow escape back to reality. They entered a large room where lines of gaunt, solemn people stood gravely before grill windows. "The enemy is listening," a sign on the wall warned him as a loudspeaker blared out a garbled message. The cop shoved him into a line. Finally, the man ahead of them fidgeted up to an ugly, hatchet-faced woman who frowned impatiently. "Yes?" she snapped. "My wife deserted me," the scarecrow of a man complained. "I want to—" "Fill out this form, drop it in slot 9, she rapped out. "Next!" "A drunken robbery suspect," the cop said. "Here's the evidence." Brightening, Hatchet-Face snatched up the fountain pen and whisked out a blue card. "Misdemeanor and felony," she breathed sharply. "I'll take the details." Engel clung to the edge of the window counter as the interrogation began. "Yes," he told them. He actually believed something invisible had knocked him down after swallowing up the stranger. No, he hadn't robbed the stranger. He wasn't confessing anything. Yes, he was an honest citizen with no previous criminal offences. After more probing questions and vicious jabs at the form, she handed it to the cop, who dropped it in a nearby wall slot. They waited for a verdict. In a moment, the cop turned to Hatchet-Face, who whispered with him excitedly. Flushed and triumphant, he steered Engel out into the hall. "Alien detection wants you," he growled with uneasy respect. They got into an elevator and shot swiftly upward. As they stepped into a lavish reception room filled with sickeningly sweet perfume, a scrawny, over-rouged girl shut a magazine and jumped to a switchboard. Then a door opened, and a short, puffy man with cold fish eyes bounced up to them. Waving the cop away, he gripped Engels's hand. "Ah, Mr. Engel," he said, smiling. "I'm Commissioner Marston. Sorry about the mix-up, but we didn't realize you were after CG. Come in, please." Bewildered, Engel followed him into an office and looked through spacious windows down at the spires of a city he had never known. Beside a desk sat a wizened old man whose yellowed skin drawn taut over his broad skull gave him a shriveled, cadaverous aspect. He tapped a blue card on a thumbnail as his luminous eyes followed Engel suspiciously. "Dr. Weave, my chief alienologist," Marston said. "Sit down, Engel." Engel grasped the arms of his chair as Dr. Weave scrutinized the card in silence. "Geoffrey Engel," he read aloud in a highly petulant voice. "Missing Persons Bureau, eh? Reminiscent of the 20th century. Is that what you call your detective agency?" "Reminiscent of?" Engel pressed shaky fingers to his throbbing head. If he told them he was from out of the past, how would they react? "Yes," he lied. "I found a fountain pen." "You lone wolves have extraordinary hunches to compensate for a lack of police techniques," Dr. Weave said with a dry chuckle. "But one needs protection when tracking aliens." "Tracking aliens?" Engel said, mystified. Marston laughed, leaned over his desk, and twirled a fountain pen in pudgy fingers. "Take it easy. You're not suspect in this case, but the report says you found this pen, and in attempting to return it to its owner, you were struck by some invisible force." Marston glanced at Dr. Weave, who nodded. Then his voice grew hard. "Did this CG aim anything at you before you were hit?" "No, he didn't," Engel said, and touched his head nervously. "Headache?" Dr. Weave asked. "No, it's nothing," Engel countered. "When I got up, the man was gone." "You mean the alien was gone?" Dr. Weave contradicted him. Engels's throat went dry, and he stared at them. "An alien!" shouted Marston. "Don't you understand?" Dr. Weave smiled thinly. "Mr. Engel's curious to learn the latest about them, and would draw us out in this childish way. I assure you we despise them far more than millions who only read about them in their daily telescripts. Since the flying saucer crash in '68, we've been very much aware of their close surveillance of this world." The doctor's face clouded as he gazed at the city. "The filthy blue spawn of Centauri send us exceedingly clever spies. Before invading our cities, they must seek out our military installations and plant explosives at key points. Their assassins must be ready to strike." Dr. Weave gently wrung bony hands, and Marston leaned forward, his pale jowls quivering angrily. "To safeguard public welfare, this city branch of alien detection must find and exterminate aliens. So far, We can boast of a perfect record, thanks to the new detection screens." "Aliens?" Engel winced, recalling the mournful little stranger. "I can't believe that he's a humanoid." Marston spat out the word as if it were a lump of vileness in his throat. "CG's a sneaking saboteur who conceals his ugly blue hide under a layer of false skin. But he's been detected." "He's detected?" Engel gasped. Dr. Weave inclined his vulture-like head quizzically. "For an intelligent man, Mr. Engel, you seem rather poorly informed." He reached to a cabinet, and across the cathode ray screen trembled a narrow ribbon of light. "As you know," he said, "every act of an organism is preceded by an attitude, and that attitude takes the form of electromagnetic brain waves. The detection screen is quite simple. Sensitive electronic devices under the city dome pick up, amplify, and transmit brain waves to the central control here. Deviations from the social norm wave are promptly investigated." He ran a gnarled finger along the ribbon of light. "Note the low, rhythmic pulsations of the norm wave. A happy citizen at a social task somewhere in the city." He adjusted a dial, and on the screen flashed a spasmodically twitching band. "A variation of antisocial type 3. A citizen planning murder. Criminal detection has a police detail observing him, and before he can strike, they'll take him in custody. Now, CG, the pseudoman we're having shadowed." A jagged white band leaped in a wild dance. "Even cerebral abnormalities don't register this violently," the doctor said. "The electrical impulses of his artificial brain are powerful. The detectors easily penetrate his feeble brain shield. He thinks he moves unnoticed on his evil mission. But look at his tremendous pent-up hatred and fear." Engel stiffened, his palms moist with sweat. CG was somewhere in this city of the future. Of course, he was feeling terrified, but these witch hunters were mistaking that terror for something else. He choked at a sudden thought. Why hadn't they discovered his own fear yet? Was his head injury somehow protecting him from their sensitive machines? Dr. Weave was regarding him stonily. "Ingenious," Engel blurted out. Marston placed an automatic on his desk, and beside it a box of shells. "Yes, ingenious," he said, grinning. "But luckily for me, these gadgets can't do everything. Trapping the alien is next, and that's my department. Show him the tracer room, Doctor." Nervously trailing Dr. Weave, Engel went to a steel door and peered through a window. For a moment, it seemed as if he were high above the twinkling lights of a city at night, until he made out a dark, sunken room and skeletal figures with earphones clamped to their long heads. They bent over a flat surface illuminated with bright grid lines and sprinkled over with a myriad glowing dots. Gaunt, shadowy faces were fixed on a pip of light. "They place him on the east side of Baxter Avenue, between 43rd and 44th Streets," Dr. Weave explained. He rubbed a lean jaw, frowning. "But how the detectives failed to pick up his presence before he reached the Civic Center baffles us. Seems as if he just popped up there." "I'm ready for the kill, gentlemen," crowed Marston, slapping the holster strap to his side. "You look pretty impressed, Engel." Yes, I am," Engel managed to say. With the doctor close behind, he followed Marston apprehensively down a corridor to a thick convex window. Marston slid it back and stepped into what resembled a bowl-shaped cockpit, a confusing maze of dials and instruments under a hemisphere of glass. Motioning Engel to a seat, he turned to the dashboard, and the same spot of light which Engel had seen in the tracer room flashed on a screen. He jabbed a button twice and picked up a microphone. "Marsden to Captain Schaefer. We're coming down." "Yes, sir. The alien's turned back," a strained voice replied. "He's now walking south on Baxter. Might be on to us. He's acting jumpy." "You sound jumpy yourself, Schaefer," Marsden snapped. "Tell your men to hold their fire this time." "All right. I have him on optibeam." Marsden spun a wheel sharply, and they were falling. Engel braced himself as a white glistening tower swung away to the left, and the geometric depths of the city loomed up. He saw the doctor take a gun from a compartment, check it, and stand up, wavering. His face was a mask of suppressed hate. "We'll dispatch him quickly," he hissed. Engel squirmed. To prevent a ruthless murder, he'd have to not only outwit these men, but countless police besides. What was worse, with his headache almost gone, his own uncontrollable waves of fear might expose him. "He's running," Marsden said with a nod at the screen. As the globe shot down past white towers, a spotlight on the glass roof flashed red, and a shrill siren stung Engels's ears. Ahead of them, a big globe fled out of their way, its passengers looking back at them, frightened. Black dots on the street scurried to the towers. "I see him," Dr. Weave screeched. Below them a man was running past a grey wall of huddled people. He looked at them, dropped a briefcase, then sprinted into the deserted street. Marsden chuckled into the mic. "We have him, Schaefer. Not putting up much of a fight, is he?" "No, sir." Marsden glided the globe a few yards above and slightly behind his quarry. As Engel stared down at the man's flapping coat and thin blonde hair, he clenched his fists. It was CG. The siren moaned to a stop, and in the sudden silence that filled the globe he could hear weary footsteps and anguished breathing. Heavy-lidded eyes narrowed at Engel. "Recognize him?" Engels's mouth opened, and his throat tightened. He closed his eyes and nodded. "Halt, alien!" Marsden's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. CG whirled, and they saw a soiled, rumpled suit and a trembling small face. A tear spilled down one cheek. Who are you?" he cried out. "What do you want?" Marsden put the muzzle of his automatic through a gun port and fired. CG screamed and fell. Then in bright, dusty sunlight, he rolled on one side, groaning, and clutched his arm where a dark stain spread slowly down his sleeve. "You disappoint us, alien," Marsden rasped. "Where's your espionage training? Where's the cunning to test our wits?" Soft, pitiful sobs answered Marsden, who barked, "Get up and run for your life." CG got up and limped away, and Dr. Weave turned in surprise. "What are you waiting for? Why don't you finish him?" Marsden grinned. "He's headed for the park, so I'll finish him there. I like some old-style hunting." "Are you taking leave of your senses?" exclaimed Dr. Weave. "What about the weapon he used on Engel? Without this armor-glass, you're risking your life." "If he has a weapon, why didn't he use it?" Marsden fumed. "It's probably in that briefcase he dropped." He bellowed into the mic, "Clear the park!" Numbly, Engel watched CG stumble past police riflemen at the end of the street and crawl into dense shrubbery. The globe zoomed ahead, then poised motionless over treetops as Marsden searched for his prey. "Watch for him," Marsden whispered huskily.
But Engel watched the screen in horror. A telltale circle of light, its rim overlapping that of CG's, burned steadily brighter. An alarm bell rang on the instrument panel. Dr. Weave raised a claw-like hand to a switch, then eyed Engel queerly. "Something wrong?" he said. "Stomach queasy?" His eyes fell on the screen. "Another alien!" he shrieked. Dr. Weave's thin lips parted, and his fingers fumbled at the safety catch of his gun. Engel hurled him aside and grabbed at the wheel. The globe keeled crazily. The trees rushed up at them. With a dull crash, the glass shattered, and struggling out of Marston's flabby arms, Engel kicked open the door and dropped to earth. He scrambled to his feet and crashed through high bushes, ducking as a lance of flame charred branches overhead. "There's two of them!" Marston's choked voice thundered and reverberated against distant towers. Engel paused in a dark glade to hear a police whistle shrill and a dry, crackling grow louder behind him. Stealthily, he crept towards sunlight. With a shock, he saw CG sitting in the open, exposed and dejected, his head bowed in pain. Engel dashed over to him, hoisted him on his shoulders, and staggered over thick grass to a gravel walk. Then the ground beneath him quaked. The hoarse cries of the hunters faded. Gently he lowered CG to a park bench, and an old man nodding in the warm sunshine raised bleary, astonished eyes. Engel turned to see a nurse pushing a baby carriage, and the old familiar skyline of the city smiling down on them. He shook with relief. Like an enraptured music lover, he listened to the faint roar of traffic. "Don't let them kill me!" CG cried. "Winos with a DTS!" the old man muttered and stomped off. "They're gone! All gone!" Engel shouted. The little fellow groaned, pressing his wound. "You help me! Your world need not fear us!" Engel spoke to him comfortingly. "Hold on, buddy. I'll get a doctor." He pushed his way through a gathering crowd to a telephone booth. As he stepped inside, he saw CG limp quickly to the subway stairs. By the time he had hurried back, the little fellow was gone. Puzzled, Engel reached for a hand railing to steady himself. He had lived a nightmare filled with obsessed men who dreaded blue-skinned aliens from a distant world. He touched something sticky and realized the bleeding CG must have clung to the railing as he descended. Then he suddenly hoped he was mistaken. The dark blotch on his fingers could be wet paint. It had to be. It was blue. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. There are lots and lots and lots of stories just waiting for you.